God bless everybody today. It's January 25th of 2021, and this video is going to compare Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and my original timelines all tie in together so we can get an extremely clear picture of what's coming up in the next 6.5 years. You can always find my videos and articles on my eschatology page on my website at End of Day Survival at endofdaysurvival.com. This also includes my PDF files of my 117-step Revelation sequential calendar. This goes from the beginning of Revelation all the way through the end. It cuts out the three additional visions John has and gives you a complete picture on the chronological order of how Revelation is laid out and from beginning to end. I've also added this new file that we're going to talk about tonight. This goes over Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, mainly Daniel 8 and 12 and Psalm 90:10, and how all these link together to give you an extremely interesting timeline of events that I've come across. Now, before we go into this too far, I had started out with now these studies go through multiple videos and articles, so you have to go back. If you don't understand some of this stuff, you're going to have to go back to the beginning and look at some of this. But I think as I go through the video, you'll see what I'm talking about, even if you haven't. This chart I did a while back was my original chart where I took Daniel 8, Daniel 12, and Psalm 90:10, and I laid them out on this graph. And this was important because we have to look at those four, I call them the three sets of days that Daniel gives us: the 1290 days, the 1335 days, and the 2300 days. And then if you take the 1260 days, or the 42 months, or the 3.5 years, which is between the signing of the covenant of death and abomination of desolation, you'll realize that if you apply these to this area up here on this timeline, that they start to make sense. So we know that 1260 days is from the signing covenant to abomination of desolation. That's the time when the Gentiles trample the city for the 3.5 years, 42 months. But then we talk about in Daniel 12, he says, and from the time the continual burnt offerings are taken away to the time of abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So if you come back up here, that's why I tell people, look at how he states this. He stops the continual burnt offerings. And then 30 days later, he signs the treaty, which takes us to abomination, which would be the 1290 days. There's 30 days prior to the signing of the covenant. And so that's a time marker stamp in itself, if you think about that. If you look at Daniel 12, it says, from the time the continual burnt offerings are taken away to the time abomination of desolation is set up, there's 1290 days. So that's why this is broken out like this. Because you have to take the 30 days prior to the signing of the treaty and then add the 1260 days, which gives you the 1290 days to abomination, okay, or abomination of desolation. That's exactly what he's saying here. You know, I do not try to mince words here. If this is what he's saying, I have to take it for what he says, not what I think and interprets it to say. So when he says, from the time the continual burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, that's a time span or gap. Okay, so that's why that works. And then he says something really important. Blessed are he who makes it, waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But go ye way to the end, for ye shall rest and shall stand up in your allotted place in the end of the days. So the 1,335 days is extremely important, because once he signs that covenant of death, you have to make it 1,335 days. And remember, he shortens that second half. And everybody says, well, what does he shorten it to? I believe it's 75 days, because he says that if you get to the 1,335 days, you're extremely blessed. Why? Because once abomination starts to occur on the ground and Antichrist goes insane and he's killing everything on the ground, literally, he has to shorten that second half to the Feast of Trumpets, or none of these people will be left. I mean, there's just won't be left. We're in great tribulation. And, it's something else I try to explain to people. We are in the sorrows and birth pains right this moment. We've started the sorrows and the birth pains when Erdogan invaded Syria on Yom Kippur. And then we started to see the virus come out, and that's going to continue in the sorrows and birth pains all the way to the time we sign the treaty, or the covenant of death with the nations, the 7-year treaty. Then we are in tribulation, and then once abomination occurs, we go to great tribulation. So there are demarcations that you need to understand here. But what I wanted to explain to you on these charts is this. This was the original Daniel 8:12 and Psalm 90:10 chart. Okay, and look at these areas here. Okay, these are going to radically change as I add Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So look at this chart real close. Got a little bit here, got a little bit of information here, and you got nothing in the middle here. Okay. But once I started to add Jeremiah, it changes everything. So I started to take Jeremiah and I started to apply it to the original graph. Now this goes actually through further than 32. It goes through the whole book of Jeremiah, but this is when I made this original video. This is what the chart looked like, and this is where I was at the time. But you realize from the old chart here, look how much is being filled in by when we add Jeremiah to this. This whole area in here is being added, and we're starting to add in some area here. Okay, see that? That's that area down here to here, okay? And there's nothing in here, and there's nothing in here. But once you add Jeremiah, it starts to fill in this gap. Okay, these gaps. And what's really cool is once you add Ezekiel in, it really starts to fill in the gaps. And that's what I wanted to explain to you, is these books run together. They overlay on top of each other. They overlay so well on top of each other, they don't even conflict with the other books in the dates that they've given us. And that's why I believe this study is so important. And what I'm going to try to lay out here in this study is how Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and all the main prophets are basically saying the same thing, and that you lay these things over the top of each other, they actually make sense, and you can find date and time stamps to these things. I consider this a paradigm of 3 modern kings because it affects 3 main players today. Jeremiah was the original catalyst that brought this to my attention, and from there it radiated out to all these other books. And I want to go over this because it does radiate into multiple books in this, and I believe it makes sense once you start to see it. So we have 3 kings that are going to matter in the end days. Okay, Reuven, which is the Israeli president that is in power now. He came in power from 2014 to present. He is only one term, and so he will be replaced in 2021, probably by Benjamin Netanyahu. At least if this prophecy makes any sense at all, I predict, if this prophecy's right, I predict right now, before March, that Benjamin Netanyahu will be elected as the new Israeli president, and we will see him go into the future as the new president. The third person, and that's saying a lot, because if he doesn't, then this prophecy doesn't seem to make any sense. So I'm just going to lay it out like that. I don't know if these things are true or not. I'm just telling you, I see these things. I want to have a conversation about them. There's a lot to this prophecy, so I think it's important that we look at it at least and have a conversation about it. Whether Benjamin Netanyahu will be elected in March will matter to this prophecy, and so it just may be wrong or it may be really right. So when I first started looking at this prophecy, and I started to see these correlations that run through different books, and that's sort of what I do. I used to be a coder back in the 1980s. That was what I did, was start out in Turbo Pascal, if you want to go way back in that day. I used to build home mortgage loans for banks, and I used to work for the one of the colleges there and some things. So I did a lot of different things in coding. That was what I did. I looked at code line by line by line, find the syntax errors, find out why the programs don't work, see why the sub-programs are not working with the main programs, and figure out how to fix them. That's what I did for a long time. So when I see things in code or in the Bible or whatever, I look at them differently than maybe some other people do, because I see these similarities and I go, wow, that matches up with that, and that matches up with that, and that's why I believe that I found that code in Revelation in 8:13, that the 3 woes and 3 trumps matter, because they do. You can only have 1, 5th, 6th, and 7 trumpet, each having an attached woe, but they can only occur once in the book to make it a chronological book. And in that review, I show you why that warning is so important. And so in this case, so these are the 3 people that I think are going to affect the paradigm the most. Rivlin, which is Zedekiah; Netanyahu, which is Yehoiakim; and Erdogan, which is Nebuchadnezzar. So Erdogan, which is the 3rd king, he's been president since 2002, and I believe he's going to maintain his status for some time to come in the future. So that's another thing. If Erdogan falls out of power between now and especially 2025, as we move through this, and he's a factor in Rivlin's prophecy here, then this is just wrong. So to make this prophecy work, 2 things have to occur that are going to happen real soon. Benjamin Netanyahu has to become the new president of Israel, or it doesn't work. And Erdogan of Turkey has to maintain his power over Turkey in the near future, in the next election cycle. So those are important things to this prophecy. One of the reasons I say that is because if we go to Jeremiah 52:30, it tells us something extremely important. In the 3 and 20 years of Nebuchadnezzar, that this captain is going to carry off these captives. Okay, I'm not going to go into this real deep right now, but it is the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar. So if it's the 23rd year, that's 2025. And something happens to this king in 2025, so that's extremely important. But something also happens to this king, and so that's why it's extremely important that as we move down through these, we start to match these dates up. So I think it's extremely important that he tells us in the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar that he's going to take all these captives, all these Jews away. And it tells us when this is going to happen later as we move through this prophecy. So if you take the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar and move that from here forward, that is 2025. And in the prophecy, there's an extremely terrible thing that happens to this Zedekiah. So if we go down to this next verse, it says this. It tells us here that it came in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, at the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah, was carried away from Jerusalem captive. Okay, so this is extremely important. So what is the 11th year of Zedekiah? Well, if you go from 2014 to 2025, that would be 11 years. And so I said, if you look at these dates, you're going to start to see these patterns form. So if the 11th year of Zedekiah is when he's carried away in the 5th month, that means in the May of 2025, we're going to start to see something happen to this King Revlin. Okay. And it goes through this in multiple books as we move through this. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go over these verses right now because we're going to go over them later. I just wanted to show you how these dates match up. Okay. And then something else I thought was extremely important to show you to begin with. So if Erdogan will be in power for 23 years by the year 2025, when Revlin is taken away and his prophecy is fulfilled in 2025, I think it matters. And then it indicates something extremely important here in Jeremiah 25:1. And the word came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judea in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah, that was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. You're going, well, that doesn't make any sense because up here it's his 23rd year. That's right. Because there's a transition between the death of Erdogan, that burying of Gog and his armies in the valley of Ham Gog, and then that resurrection of Antichrist. So what is the 4th year of Jehoiakim? Well, that would be 2025. And so that's what I keep saying is these two kings are working in tandem in Israel at the same time while they're under siege. It's just not Benjamin Netanyahu as the president and he's doing all these things. This Revlin guy is going to be a former president, but he will affect Israel as we move forward. And so you're going to see both kings being affected constantly by this man Nebuchadnezzar or Erdogan of Turkey. And so if you come down here, this is extremely important. So if the 4th year of Jehoiakim is the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, why is it this is the 1st year of the Nebuchadnezzar when we're talking about it being the 23rd year up here? Because Erdogan dies on the 6th seal. Remember, Erdogan is the 1st seal. Okay? He's the white horseman. He's the one that brings the catalyst out. And then he's going to die on that 6th seal. And then we're going to see an Antichrist rise from him. Okay? And when does that happen? Between 23 and 24, we start to see that destruction of Gog and the rising of Antichrist in 2024, which I'll show you on these charts I have. And then his first year would be what? 24 to 25. So I think it's extremely important that maybe that's why this is the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, Turkey. Okay? And this is why it's his first year, because he's going to die on the sixth seal, and then he's going to be brought back as an antichrist just shortly after that. So the first king, his first year of that Jeremiah 25:1 states that the fourth year of Jehoiakim, which is Netanyahu, which would be in 2025, would be the first year of the first king Nebuchadnezzar. So how can we justify those numbers when it tells us clearly before that it was the 23rd year? Because there's a transition between, he comes out on the first seal on Yom Kippur on October 9th, 2019, and he dies on the sixth seal when he's sieging Jerusalem, which I'm going to show you here as we move through this. They bury him in those graves in Ham Gog with his armies, and we start to see a resurrection event in 2024. And so the first year of the new king would be between 24 and 25. Okay? I hope it's not confusing, and I'm hoping I can explain this as we move through the charts and things to make more sense of this. So, but this would be why we have this transition from 23 years of Erdogan into the first king of Babylon. Now, Gog of Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is creating all this havoc to the point he dies here, he's a human being person like you or me. This is Erdogan of Turkey. But he's going to die here, and then he's going to be resurrected into a supernatural being on the sixth trumpet. Okay? And you're going, well, that's just crazy talk. No. Antichrist is not a human being. It tells you in Isaiah 14 and I don't know how many different places this is going to be a resurrectional being and that he will be supernatural. Revelation 13 goes through this. He's literally taking Satan from heaven, throwing him to the earth, but he is not going to touch the grave. He's going to impregnate these two beings, the false prophet and the Antichrist, and that they stopped those continual burnt offerings and signed that covenant of death. We have 1260 days to abomination. So this is extremely important. So this is why I think it's so important that we look at these date stamps that Jeremiah and Ezekiel especially are giving us. Excuse me. So in the 11th year of Zedekiah or Revlin, which would be in 2025, he is taken away captive. And we're going to go into more detail because it gets extremely specific about what happens to this king or this president of Israel, Reuven. And that this would be the 23rd year of Erdogan, which would be 2025 because he came into power in 2002. He was elected in. Didn't really come into power in 2003, but he was actually already elected in 2002. And that this would be the fourth year of Netanyahu, which would be 2025. So it all lines up at least on the three kings. Okay, and so that's why I keep looking at this going, why is this lining up so much? And then why is it the first year of Nebuchadnezzar when it was the 23rd year up here? Because at the 23rd year of Erdogan, he's going to die just the year prior to that. And then he's going to be brought back as Antichrist. So he would then become the first king by 2024 into 2025, which would be his first year. So based on what Jeremiah and Ezekiel are telling us, Erdogan is going to die around October 25th of 2023 as he's sieging Jerusalem. And I'm going to show you these dates as we move through here. I'm just trying to lay this out so you can understand why these numbers are coming up and where they're coming up. So I believe that shortly after that, in 2025, in April 9th of 2025, we're going to see Revlin, or this King Zedekiah, taken away to Babylon. I'm going to go into this timeline as we move forward, as we get down into here. This starts to actually create a timeline that then goes back to those charts that I was talking to you. And this is where it gets really interesting, I believe. And it lines up so perfectly. I got to believe there's something to this. So this is why I call it the Revlin prophecy, because once Erdogan dies and comes back as Antichrist, he then takes this King Revlin to Turkey or Babylon, captive, as it states up here. He carries all these people away into captivity, and it will also tell us this as we move forward. So I believe that both Revlin and Netanyahu play important roles in the attack on Israel and Jerusalem in end days, and that Israel will have one president at the time, Netanyahu, but both presidents will be activated during this time of distress. So I've said for a while, if you look at Joel 1 and 2, and even 3, I'll go through them all, you'll see what I mean by this. So Joel 1 is an effect of locusts, famines, and plagues on Israel. Okay? And so if you look at Ezekiel 5:12, it tells us something extremely important. We have a third die by famines and plagues, we have a third die by the sword, and we have a third taken away, the hidden place. So Joel 1 to me is the plagues and locusts that are going to start to affect Israel prior to the time Gog, which is Joel 2, gets there, which is Erdogan. And then he attacks Israel and besieges it. When you get into Joel 3, that's all about Armageddon, and that is not the same as Joel 2. Joel 3 would be a 6-bowl event, and that's a long time from where we are here. I'm going to take you to the chart in just a second, but I want to show you this real quick. So in the spring of 2023, I believe we'll see a locust event start to affect Israel, because Joel 1 has to happen before we see Joel 2 occur, okay, which is the attack of Erdogan, or Gog, when he besieges Jerusalem. Okay, and it clearly tells us, as we move through here, on October 10th of 2023, Erdogan or Gog is going to besiege Jerusalem. And that I believe this is the same time that Erdogan gives the 10 Muslim nations the authority for 1 hour or 15 days to attack Israel, and then they are destroyed, as it tells us in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And I want to go over these verses with you real quick. So the first thing I want to point out before we get too far into this is that chapter 52 of Jeremiah is a review of the prior chapters. Okay, so it's sort of a synopsis. But when you look at 52 and you take it back into the prior chapters, you realize that they give you more depth. So let's read 39:1 first. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah, which is Revlin, so the 9th year would be in 2023, because he was president in 2014, so the 9th year would be 2023. The 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, or Erdogan, is besieging Jerusalem. Okay, so this would be the 10th month of 2023. When you go into 52:4, it tells us the 9th year of his reign. In the 10th month of the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and his armies are against Jerusalem, pitched against it, and built forts around it. So they're in the process of besieging it. But look at that. In the 10th month of the 9th year of the 10th day, okay, that's 10/10 of 23. So if you go to the chart, you'll see that I started to plug these dates in. As we move forward, we're going to see some serious things start to take place here. So I've said for a while, Joel 1 has to happen before Joel 2. So Joel 1, we'd start to see the locusts and plagues start to affect Israel in the spring of 2023. As we start to get in the fall, we're going to start to see Israel being besieged by Erdogan. They haven't broken through the walls. They're just attacking the city, and they're attacking the country at this time. They do not break through the walls for almost 2 years. I'm going to show you that here in a minute. And so if October 10th of 2023 is when they start to siege Jerusalem, and he gives those 10 nations authority for 1 hour or 15 days, 1 hour of God's time is 15 days on our planet, that he will then die on the 6th seal by the wrath of God, or the wrath of the Lamb, or Jesus. It's not the wrath of God. 6:16 is the wrath of the Lamb, or Jesus. The wrath of God tells you clearly that that is the 7 bowls, and that starts in Revelation 15:1. But then you have that 7-month burial, and they burn the weapons for 7 years, alluding to this all down through here. Okay. And then the 7th seal is broken. You have a half an hour of silence. 144,000 elect are being selected. And then look at that. I show you the 4 winds are being held back until when? The 6th trumpet, when Antichrist is released. You have the first 4 trumpets destroy 1/3 of the planet, which are the communist areas. You have the 5th trumpet, which is the bottomless pit, opens, and the scorpions come out and sting them for 5 months. And I think that's extremely important, because if you go from this time forward, that's about a 5-month gap between Antichrist comes out and the scorpions are stinging people, and they sign that covenant of death. You're going from October, you got November, January, or November, December, January, February, March, and then April. So that's 5 months. You got that pit opens up, those scorpions come out. You have the rising of the Antichrist and the false prophet, and then we get the spring equinox, and then he stops the continual burnt offerings, and then he signs a covenant of death. And what happens? I've said for a while, these 10 nations of Muslims are going to be destroyed on the 6th seal. They're going to start to form down into 4 regions through the chaos. Antichrist comes up, overthrows the 3 other regions, and then it becomes a diversified beast kingdom. Okay, so now let's go back to Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel and look at how these things are starting to line up here. So let's say we have that Joel 1 locust event in 2023. Okay, it has to be Joel 1, has to happen before we get to Gog and Joel 2. Okay, so you got to have this locust event. It tells us it starts to ravage the fortunes of Israel. And if you go back to that original chart, I've talked a number of times about the Shemitah year starting on September 7th of 2021. This is the start of the new sabbatical Shemitah year. This is a 7-year cycle. And what happened back in 70 AD, the second temple, or the Jews' fortune started to fail. And we saw that destruction of the second temple, which was then the next year we saw that rise of the Babylonian Empire, which will then be the Ottoman Empire, is now rising. Babylonian in the old days, Ottoman in the new days as we move forward here. Erdogan's nightmare is 10 nations will start to rise, but they're going to die on this sixth seal, okay? But that sabbatical year matters. It starts here and it ends, that 6-year cycle right before the 7th year where we have the year of forgiveness ends right before the Feast of Trumpets, or the Feast of Trumpets on October 2nd and 3rd of 2027. And so that's what I mean. You get to the 7th trumpet, which is the Feast of Trumpets on October 2nd and 3rd of 2027. We are with the Lord, and so we start moving into the millennial phase then. So this does matter. So if you go back here and look at this text file, we have that locust event start, and then Gog starts to besiege or attack Jerusalem and is already in Israel. Based on these verses, that these dates start to line up. So let's look at these real quick again. 10th month, 9th year. 9th year, 10th month, 10th day. 9th year, 10th month, 10th day. So they're all talking about the same thing, and they're all talking about the same kings and how he's going against Jerusalem on that day. So if that's the case, on October 10th of 2023, Erdogan or Gog will start to besiege or siege Jerusalem and are already started to attack Israel. Okay? And then he starts getting into more detail. I believe that he gives those 10 nations 1 hour of power, as it tells us in Revelation 17:12. They will die on the 6th seal by the hand of Jesus, not God. This is the wrath of the Lamb, as Revelation 6:16 states. It's the wrath of the Son, not of the Father. And so 15 days later, we would see the death of Erdogan and his armies, and that they would be buried for 7 months in a grave called Hammon Gog, and they'd burn the weapons for 7 years, alluding to the start of the tribulation period. We're still in the sorrow, so we have to equate part of that. And that these 10 nations would be destroyed. They deform down into 4 regions or kingdoms. That at that point we would see 4 trumpets sound. And then look at that. That's really cool, man. So the 4 trumpets sound and devastate a third of the planet or the communist areas, China, Russia, and that area, to insulate or buffer the area of the Middle East. We see that eagle in that 3 trumps, 3 woe warning that I've been talking about, built that whole chart of the 117 steps on. It's important that we understand that he's warning us this about the 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet, because he needs to let us understand that these are here for a reason. The 5th trumpet is when the bottomless pit opens. The 6th trumpet is when the Antichrist and the false prophet rise. And the 7th trumpet, which is way down here, is when the Lord comes back. Okay? So let's go through this chart and we'll show you how all this works. So if the eagle comes out after the 4th trumpet and sounds and tells us, look, you need to watch these last 3 trumpets for a reason. And I explained to you in that one article why the 5th and 6th and 7th trumpet can only happen once. Okay? The 5th trumpet happens in 9:1. The 6th trumpet happens in 9:13. But at the end of chapter 10, he clearly tells John he's going to take him into an additional vision. So it doesn't tell you when the 7th trumpet's actually going to sound. It tells you it's almost going to sound, but it doesn't. In Revelation 10:7, I believe. When does it sound? It sounds in Revelation 15:1 when he hands out the 7 bowls, because the 7th trump now has sounded. He is now handing out the 7 bowls, and they go forth with the wrath of God. And what happens on the 7th trumpet? The Lord comes back and raptures away the people from great tribulation. So once the continual burnt offerings are stopped, right after the 6th trump sounds and the Antichrist rises, false prophet rises, the 4 regions are now in have gone from 10 to 4. He overthrows the other 3 regions. This turns into a diversified beast kingdom. Antichrist now is on the ground. He stops the continual burnt offerings. He signs that treaty with the nations, as it tells us in Daniel 12:1. He's going to sign those nations after he stops the continual burnt offerings, and then we have 1260 days from the 30 days to abomination. And then we start getting back into Ezekiel and Jeremiah's prophecies again. And I'm telling you, this stuff matches up. It's so crazy. It's just ridiculous. So when we get into this next part of this prophecy, we realize that he's talking about Egypt. And what have I been talking about Egypt for a while? So Erdogan is now pushing the Kurds into Iran. Okay. And then once he destroys Iran and absorbs Iran, he's going to drive across Iraq, through part of Jordan, into Israel, and then into Egypt, and he's going to be stuck here where Jeremiah puts those stones. I talked about he plants those stones up here, and then Erdogan can't get any further, and then Erdogan gets pulled back between the 2 seas before he attacks Israel. And once he starts to attack Israel and besieges Jerusalem on October 10th of 2023, we're going to see them attack for 15 days and then the decimation of all those armies by October 25th of 2023, based on those charts and things I was just showing you. But Jeremiah and a number of books clearly tell us that there's going to be a war that continually happens between Turkey and Egypt. Okay? What's going to happen is once he gets down here, he gets destroyed, and then this residue that's around the city as it's being sieged is still going to continuously attack this country for up to 2 years. It tells us that this will happen till the 11th year of Revlin, okay, and so this is 2025, which they will then finally break in the walls, okay, and I'm going to show you that as we move forward into this prophecy. But what's going to happen is, as Egypt and Turkey are constantly battling back and forth, see, Israel's being under siege. They can't get in here, okay? So Egypt and Turkey are going to have to skirt around here and go right through Damascus as they're attacking back and forth. And it clearly tells us in Daniel 11 that there's these back and forth skirmishes, that Egypt gets an upper hand occasionally and takes stuff back, spoils back from Turkey. And then Turkey gets upset and runs down there and attacks Egypt. But sooner or later, Turkey gets the upper hand and finally comes down here and just decimates Egypt. But this is why Damascus will have no stone left upon each other, because by the time all this action is occurring, there will be nothing left of Damascus. It will run directly right through the city, and there just won't be anything left of it by the time they're done. Now, once the signing of the treaty occurs, then we start to get into Ezekiel's prophecy that affect the back end of this. And that's what I mean. This all fits directly together. And so if we go to that chart, I'm going to start to show you where that affects this on the timeline. So now we're on the other side of the treaty. Everything before this was over here when Jeremiah was talking about. But then we start getting into the stopping of continual burnt offerings, the signing of the covenant of death, and then Ezekiel starts talking about this king of Egypt and what's going to affect the country of Egypt itself. So we're at the signing of the covenant of death, and then he tells us something extremely important in the next step of the prophecy. He's talking about the prophecy against Egypt and its king. And Egypt will be devastated by plagues, similar to what Israel happened, by famine and by the sword, and that these verses here will affect this prophecy. Okay, and so again, it's a similar Ezekiel 5:12 effect where we're being affected by plagues, famine, and by the sword, and that a residue of these people will be taken away. And I want to show you these verses and how that all occurs. So always come back to Ezekiel 5:12 because it seems like every nation that's under judgment either dies by pestilence, famine, or sword, and somehow a third or residue is taken away. And he's saying the same thing in Ezekiel 29:1 and 2, and Ezekiel 34 and 10. I think it's pretty important because it tells us here in the 10th year, in the 10th month of the 12th day of the month, that he sets his face against the king of Egypt. Okay, so October 12th of the 10th year would be 10/12 of 24. So if we plug that into the chart, we can see that on 10/12 of 24, we have a devastating effect on Egypt by plagues, famine, and they're being under attack. Okay? And that by January 7th of 2025, Egypt is completely broken by Antichrist, and the people are scattered throughout the nations. And that tells us in Ezekiel 30:20 and 21, and Ezekiel 30:23 through 26 that this is occurring. So if you go to this verse in Ezekiel 30:20, 21, it tells us in the first month, or January, 7th day of the 11th year, so January 7th of 2025, that he is going to break the arm of the king of Egypt, and that Egypt is basically under siege by the sword. Okay? And he says in Ezekiel 30:23 to 26, he will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and will disperse them through the countries, and I will strengthen the army of the king of Babylon and put the sword in his hand, and I will break Pharaoh's army, or the king of Egypt, and he shall groan from all the pain and from all the deadly wounded men. So there's going to be a lot of carnage on the ground at this time. And if you come back up to that verse prior to this, which is right after that signing of the treaty of death, or with the nations, and those continual burnt offerings are stopped, we have the prophecy against Egypt and its king, okay, which is this Ezekiel 29:1 through 2 and Ezekiel 30:4 through 10. So if we come back to Ezekiel 30:4 through 10, it tells us that a sword shall come against Egypt, and the great pain shall come to Ethiopia, and that we will see Ethiopia, Libya, Lydia, and all these different areas being affected by this. You're talking about the 10 nations of Ezekiel, 38-39, Gog of Ezekiel. We have all those 10 Muslim nations, Ethiopia, Libya, Lydia, all these places are being affected, and they're going to be destroyed by God or by Jesus, or the hand of Jesus himself, the hand or the wrath of the Lamb. All these armies will be effectively destroyed. Now it does tell us that he's going to leave a remnant of 1/6 behind. So it tells us in Ezekiel 30:20, 21, and Ezekiel 23 through 26, that on January 7th of 2025, Egypt will be completely broken by Antichrist and the peoples will be scattered throughout the nations. And then the next verse that comes up is on March 1st of 2025. The king of Egypt and his peoples will be cut off from the world, and they will be slain by the Assyrian or Antichrist. And so we're going to see some severe things start to really happen in 2025. And then we start to see what I call, we're getting into the Revlin prophecy, okay? But let's look at that Ezekiel 31, 1 through 18 first. I mainly want to show you this time date stamp in 31, 1 through 18, because it clearly tells us again, in the 11th year, which is 25, of Revlin, which, like I say, he's the president in 2014, 11 years later, 2025, third month, which is March, and the first day of the month, so this is March 1st of 2025, we start to see a lot of things happening to Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt, and his country, and how they're going to basically be decimated by the Assyrian. And I'm not going to go into all this. I just mainly, like I say, we're talking about these date stamps and how they're going to affect this pattern of events as we move forward. So we come back to the chart, and March 1st of 2025, the king of Egypt and his people are cut off from the world. And then we go to the next part, and it clearly tells us that the famines become so severe in Jerusalem, they really start to affect the whole country, to where there's literally no food in this country, and they are resorting to cannibalism at this point. It clearly tells us they are literally eating their children. And so this is as bleak a time in Jerusalem and Israel's history as we've ever seen, but this will be a future event that's coming upon them. So if we look at Jeremiah 52:6 and 52:7, it clearly tells us on April 9th, 2025, that Jerusalem will have no food, that the famine will be so severe, and that they will breach the city at this time. And that is going to cause a chain of events against the President Revlin as we move forward here. So if we go to Jeremiah 52:4, it says this: in the 9th year, which is 23, in the 10th month of the 10th day of the month of Nebuchadnezzar, he laid siege on Jerusalem, and that it is besieged until the 11th year. Okay, so that's 2025. So when we get to this April 9th of 2025, we start to see an extremely horrific event happen to the first president of Israel. I do not believe anyone has brought this prophecy up. I believe this is something that's new. I do not believe anyone has... I can't find it. I can't Google it. I can't seem to find anyone that has brought this up before. So I want to go over what I've found here. So on April 9th of 2025, we see a famine so severe in Jerusalem that there is no food left, and they have now breached the city and now are entering the city. Okay. And when the city is broken up, that were assigned through the treaty, the residue of the princes, now this is what's left of Gog's armies of the 4 regions, are now the new 4 beast kingdom. All these armies combined, and they are now attacking Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself is under siege, and they have now broken through the walls and they're in the city. And so Israeli President Revlin flees the city to the plains of Jericho. Okay. It tells us this in Jeremiah 39:5 and Jeremiah 52:8. And so they pursue this king, and they overtake him in the plains of Jericho. And then he is brought to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, to Riblah, which is in the very southern part of Turkey. And so we know he's taken them up into Turkey, and that he will place judgment upon them. And again, that summary of 52 of Jeremiah, it tells us that this king is pursued and he's overtaken in the plains of Jericho, and that his armies will be scattered. And so they are basically being captured and overtaken. And that once this King Revlin, or Zedekiah, is taken to Babylon and is taken before the King Nebuchadnezzar in Riblah, that he will have his eyes removed. So Zedekiah, or Revlin's eyes, will be taken from him, and he will be bound and chained and carried into Babylon, and that he will be placed in judgment, and that his sons will be killed. Okay? And so this is a pretty brutal prophecy against this king if this actually happens. And so they find this king, they pursue this king, they take him to the king of Babylon, he's judged, his eyes are removed, and he's placed in chains, and he's carried down to Babylon, and he is not killed. He is held there, okay? So he is not killed. This King Revlin is not killed. He's just captured and placed in captivity in horrendous conditions, okay? And that the captain will then take the remainder of the people away. And that's what we saw at the very beginning when I first started talking about this, was the captain would then take that remnant away and capture them, and we would also see the fleeing of the remnant prior to that, when Gog attacks and the third flee to the hidden place. But this is during the siege, and this is in the 11th year, so this is 2025, that a remnant's already been removed. These are the people that are left in the city. The walls hadn't been broken down, so Jerusalem hadn't up to this point been taken over. But once this occurs and the walls are knocked in and they start to enter the city, then this King Revlin is then running for his life. He is caught out on the plains of Jericho, which are north of Jerusalem. So that makes sense. They're pushing him north, and then he's captured and he's taken away into captivity. And if you go into 52 and Jeremiah, it gives you even more detail, and that's what I talk about, is these go back and forth. You can pick up more detail if you go back and forth. But it also indicates that the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah. And so he's going to kill a lot of his family. Zedekiah, or Revlin, is going to be captured, taken into Babylon. His eyes are going to be removed. He's going to be chained, and he's going to be left there. And so there's a lot happening here. I think it's an extremely grim prophecy against potentially this King Revlin. But I think it needs to be talked about, and I believe it falls in line with what I've been showing you on the charts. So if we go back into this April 9th of 2025, there's no food. Revlin is taken away. He's caught. The city's breached at that point. Zedekiah flees in the plains of Jericho. He's captured. He's taken to Babylon. And then shortly after April 9th of 2025. On May 10th of 2025, we see that the house of the Lord is burned and destroyed. The king's house, this is Revlin's house. He's just been captured up here, remember? They're in the city now. All the houses of Jerusalem are being plundered, and Revlin's eyes have been plucked out by May 10th, and he's been taken away. And so I had made a question here that I believe that after Jerusalem is besieged and Antichrist takes over this, then between May of 10th of 2025 and the time abomination occurs, they would have time to rebuild that temple, the third temple. And if abomination occurs on July 19th of 2027, they would have almost 2 years to rebuild that temple. Okay, so they would have 2 years to rebuild the temple, and then we would see abomination occur, and then he gets into another prophecy of Netanyahu's son, I believe. So check this out. So on July of 2025, the son of, look at the spelling of that, Netanyahu. Netanyahu? Is that what it's saying? Of the royal seeds of the prince of the king, of the son of Netanyahu, affects this region. Because what happens is, and I went into this a little bit, you got to realize that this Netanyahu ends up coming back to Jehoiakim. Okay, if you go out and look at it. So he's a descendant of Jehoiakim, which is Netanyahu. So is this the son of Netanyahu? It has to be. And it talks about how this son will kill a regional leader that Erdogan, or Antichrist, because now he's Antichrist, he's been brought back as Antichrist, he's a supernatural being, we're into 2025, and that this son will destroy this regional leader. Okay, he rises up with 10 men, he smotes or kills this gentleman. Actually, if you go into the book, he kills about 60 to 70 people, and that 10 of them try to parlay food and land and things with them because they're under destitution of famine up here, so they don't have anything. And so these last 10 say, hey, you know what, we'll give you all this stuff if you don't kill us. And they say, you know what, we're so destitute, we'll take that offer. And so when we get into this, we start to see that the son of Jehoiakim, I believe it's Abner, will start to proclaim a fast to the Lord in September of 2026. And this is Jeremiah 36, 6 through 9. And then on October 5th of 2026, Jerusalem is smitten, destroyed, and Israel is laid desolate and utterly destroyed. And so if we want to go look at that, that's 33, 21 through 33. So if you go to Ezekiel 33, 21 through 33, it tells us in the 12th year, which would be 2026, in the 10th month of the 5th day of the month, that the city of Jerusalem is smitten. Okay. So if you go to the chart, you can see that the son of Netanyahu has killed this leader, which must really upset Antichrist, because then he smites Jerusalem. And then shortly after that, he places a lamentation against Egypt, and that's the next step. So we're going to see a major finalization of the country of Egypt here coming up real soon. So if we come back to the chart, in July of 2025, the son of Netanyahu kills this regional leader. By September, he's asking to proclaim a fast before the Lord. This death of this regional leader must really aggravate Antichrist, because then he, in September, right after this fast, in October, we see Jerusalem is smitten and utterly destroyed. And then December 1st of 2026, God places a lamentation and net over Egypt and states he will kill and judge everything there. Now, he hasn't done it yet, but he's telling them that this is going to happen. And this is in Ezekiel 32, 1 through 16. He tells us clearly on December 15th of 2026 that a multitude in Egypt are cast down. This is also Ezekiel 32:18, that they will lie with the heathen in a pit of hell, and that the king of Egypt will perish with all his people. So the king of Egypt will die, based on this prophecy, on December 15th of 2026. So I guess you could have a prophecy against the king of Egypt, which is, and today Al-Sisi is the president of Egypt. And so, are we talking about this gentleman? It's possible, because he can get a second term, and so it is possible that this gentleman here is the king that we're talking about in this prophecy at the very end. And so right after the destruction of this king of Egypt with his people, a terrible judgment against this nation, we will start to see the ramping up of that temple being built and abomination of desolation occurring, which is on, I say July 19th of 2027 based on my chart, and that we will see on Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets, the seventh trumpet happen on October 2nd and 3rd of 2027. Maybe that's why we don't know which day Jesus comes back, because it's a 2-day festival. I think it's on the 2nd, because it's a gap between the 2nd and the 17th, which is 15 days or 1 hour of God's wrath, which would be from the 7th trumpet sounding. We start the bowl phase. You have 7 bowls, and then we see the cleansing of the planet on the 7th bowl, and we start to walk into the millennial kingdom time frame. So, to make a long story short, if you take Daniel 8, Daniel 12, Psalm 92, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and all these other prophets, and you start to mesh these time date stamps together, you'll realize that they fit perfectly in this chart that I had originally built. Now, I originally built this chart a while back, and you'll see that this has not changed anywhere, okay? But once you plug Jeremiah in to these areas and Ezekiel into these areas, you start seeing something really cool. And that's this. And it fills in these holes completely. And I haven't changed anything on this chart, which is almost scary, because if this is truly a prophecy with date stamps, then we have a pretty good accurate idea of when and what is coming and what is going to happen in the next 6.5 years. So if we go back into the last of the date stamps, which is here, and that's when Egypt is cast down and the king of Egypt is perishes. That's December 15th of 2026. We start to see the ramping up of abomination. the two witnesses that came out on the signing of the covenant and prophesied for 1260 days, then are overthrown by Antichrist. They're resurrected in 3.5 days. We see the end of the 6-year Shemitah cycle on September 1st through the 3rd of 2027. The Lord comes back, raptures away the saints, martyrs, and elect of great tribulation. And then we start to, in that bowl phase, okay, and you get to the 6th bowl. We have the Battle of Armageddon. The 7th bowl is poured out in the air, and we see then the planet then re-cleansed and re-fermented. The Lord is with us. We are in heaven here. And so the millennial takes place in heaven, because once you get through the millennial, at the end of the story, New Jerusalem is then brought down back to earth and rejoined to the earth at the end of the 1,000 years. And the reason that the Gog-Magog war of Revelation 20 here is different than Ezekiel 38 and 39 over here is this. Gog and his 10 nations of armies will go against Israel, and they will be buried in a dirt grave called Ham Gog. Okay, and then Gog and will be resurrected. And so Gog of Ezekiel 38-39 is buried, okay, and is only brought back in a resurrectional event. The reason that is different than Gog of Revelation 20 is that if you go out and look at that, God himself in heaven destroys these spiritual beings by his hand, with fire from his hand. Okay, they're not buried. They're spiritual, so unless they're thrown in a lake of fire, the only way to destroy these beings is through fire, through God's hand. And so that's why they never see the second death, because they're never placed in front of the book of life. And so the saints, martyrs, and the people that fail, once they get in the millennial, if they do fail, God will destroy them at the very end once Satan is released, and then we then bring New Jerusalem back to the planet, and that's the end of the story. New Jerusalem is united with the earth, and the kingdom of God is the kingdom of on earth again once more. So I know there was a lot of content here. Hopefully I made some sense of it. I know it's a lot to take in. Look at the time stamps on these verses. Look at the 3 kings that I brought forward, and look at how long they've been in power. And if Erdogan stays in power, then I'm guessing that he is the king of Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar. And if Netanyahu is elected in 2021, then I'm guessing that he is Jehoiakim. And if that all lines up, then I'm guessing the 3rd president falls in line, and that's Revlin. And we see a terrible fate of this President Revlin. And I always look at these things and I send prayers out, but God will not change his judgments. We've already broken the first seal when Erdogan went into Syria on October 9th of 2027. I do not believe there's a way to turn this clock back. And like I had just put in my last video, we had that 4 blood moon tetrad in 2020 with that 6 to 7 planet astrological conjunction over the United States on the 4th of July with a blood moon event was a omen of destruction to this country, which will bring on judgment and probably the reduction of our freedoms as we see a Joe Biden election, elected president occur. I don't see a lot good coming up here in the near future. And if we start to see all this play out, and like I say, the thing I'm looking for is to watch the Kurds align with Iran by the middle of this year into fall, and then Turkey going over and crushing them. And if that happens, then Daniel 8 prophecies occurred. And then we're going to start to watch Erdogan gain his Ottoman crown, build his 10 Ottoman horn nation of Muslims, or the 10 nations that go against Israel. And by October 10th of 2023, we will actually see the start of the siege of Israel and Jerusalem itself. God bless everybody. Please find the narrow open door. It's Jesus. He's the only way to the Creator. This time right now is a moral hazard issue for everybody. You got to reassess your lives. You got to put oil in your lamp. You got to put supplies in your house. It's going to be a long 6.5 years. I do not know how long you will make it down this road. Every country, every place will be under judgment. I'm under judgment. You're under judgment. We're all under judgment at this point. There is no free ticket ride out of here. You will be here till the seventh trumpet when the Lord comes back. And that in my calendar is October 2nd or 3rd of 2027. So you're going to be here for a while. God bless you. Be safe out there. Get everything ready. The war is on, and we got a long way to go, people. So be safe and be faithful to the Lord to the end. That is all you need to know. God bless.